Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining today's session on leveraging science and technology innovation for diplomacy. My name is Dalan Najib. I work at the U.S. National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine in Washington, D.C., where I currently serve as the Senior Director for Science and Engineering Capacity Development. It's a true privilege to be part of this important forum and moderate today's session on a vital topic at the intersection of innovation and diplomacy. So over the past 2 days, we've heard a lot about the challenges that are facing the world, from pandemics to climate change to food insecurity, water scarcity. And it is clear that the need for innovative solutions to these problems is now more urgent than ever. Yet, advanced technologies are often seen as national assets. They are jealously guarded and at times even weaponized. So this creates barriers for cooperation. It sows division and hinders our collective progress in solving today's most pressing problems. In this context, innovation diplomacy comes as a powerful solution. By harnessing the potential of science and technology, innovation diplomacy fosters cooperation, dialogue, and joint problem solving across borders. One example is the global response to the COVID-19 pandemic, where basically unprecedented collaboration between regulators, scientists, and the private sector led to the rapid development and deployment of vaccines, saving countless lives. Today's panel will explore how we can reframe our approach to technology so that it is making it a resource for all of humanity rather than a source of division. We will discuss what is needed to put innovation diplomacy into practice while ensuring that equity and inclusion are core principles of our global cooperation. Experts from industry, government, academia will share their insights on how we can find inclusive pathways for collaboration. We hope that the conversation today will spark new ideas for partnership as we seek to unlock the full potential of science and technology for the greater good of all. So I have the distinct privilege to be joined on stage today by our esteemed panelists. You can access their extensive bios in the program, so I will only introduce them briefly. Starting to my immediate left, Your Excellency Jeroen Koorman, Director General for Bilateral Affairs, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Belgium, a career diplomat, 27 years career, where he completed assignments in Kinshasa, Tokyo, Afghanistan, Washington, D.C., and the UN, among others. To his immediate left, Dr. Iyabo Tinubu-Karch, the CEO of Sidra Medicine, a women's and children's hospital in the state of Qatar. She has extensive clinical experience in general internal medicine, hospital, and geriatric medicine. Prior to joining Sidra, she worked as a clinical instructor at University of Washington, where she also serves as a consultant physician in health system improvement in Nigeria. Dr. Hilal Lashwal, Research Development and Innovation Advisor to the Qatar Foundation Chairperson and Executive Director of RDI. He's also a leading neuroscientist and directs the Laboratory of Chemical Biology of Neurodegeneration at EPFL in Lausanne, and is the founder and CEO of ND Biosciences. Also very active on LinkedIn. If you don't follow him, you should. Dr. Hector Cadena Suarez, President-elect of the Mexican Council on Foreign Relations, COMEXI. He's also president and CEO of the Ergo Group and a professor of practice in public policy at UC Berkeley. He has over 25 years in public policy, digital transformation, and international cooperation. Last but not least, Mr. Hossein Abdullah, senior advisor, Ramsey AI, an AI company with a specific focus on working with governments. He was previously the executive director at the Office of Tony Blair. Over the past 2 decades, Mr. Abdullah has led engagement driving flagship projects in areas that span technology, infrastructure, climate action, and national security, among others. Welcome. Okay, so we have about 45 minutes for this session. Let me see, because we... Okay, so we will start with a discussion among the panelists, and we will leave some time for questions from the audience towards the end. So the opening question for all the panelists is, where do you see the biggest opportunities for science, technology, and innovation to drive diplomacy? Please keep your responses to about 3 minutes. Thank you. Starting with Your Excellency Corman.
Well, thank you, Dalal. And I was thinking when walking in, maybe in the future there could be a panel of artificially intelligent robots. Maybe the outcome could be better or worse, but it would be a good test for technology and diplomacy. Now, coming back to your question, diplomacy is typically seen as a very traditional space. People think of backroom deals and all that. But really, we've learned that we can really leverage innovation to build more effective diplomacy. And one of the few things that come to mind is to better deliver on global public goods. You mentioned healthcare during the COVID-19 outbreak. Innovation really gives us a tool to deliver on these public goods in a more efficient way. When I think about Belgian experience, we have companies like Universals. They build up a global platform that really allows countries to bring drugs, to manufacture drugs and vaccines in developing countries throughout the world at 50% of the speed and 70% reduction in cost. So it really helps to deliver these global public goods. A second example is the use of big data analysis and artificial intelligence. I think it could be used in cases for conflict prevention. If we are able to better connect the dots and then compare to previous patterns of what happened in the past, maybe in the future we can better prevent conflicts. That could be something. A third example that I would want to give is the Global Sustainable Technology and Innovation Community. Happens to be a Belgian initiative that connects innovators, entrepreneurs, researchers, and industry leaders and policymakers worldwide to accelerate technological solutions to reach the Sustainable Development Goals. So there is a lot that can be done with technology, and then the question is, how do we get there as a diplomatic community? I think the first thing we need is a strategic alignment and an integration of policy and of innovation throughout government. Technology should not be something just, and innovation should not be something just a part dealt with just innovation departments. It should be mainstreamed throughout the organization. We will also have to foster global partnerships between countries at multilateral level, but also between governments, academia, research institutions, and private sector. Third, we need to build capacity and resilience. It is important that it is innovation for all, as you mentioned, equity and inclusion. That means building the right infrastructure, also having good talent and talent development. The fourth element will be governance and coordination, building truly innovation platforms. And I think the fifth and last element would be the risk management and security measures, because we have to make sure that innovation is actually force for good, that it is in line with our national security objectives, but also with our values of ethical government, multilateralism. These are things that are dear to us, and we have to make sure that innovation does not become a threat to these things.
Thank you for that. Dr. Karch.
Thank you for the opportunity for being here. I see several opportunities, both as a practicing or previously practicing physician, leader of a healthcare and academic medical center. The first one being gene therapy and rare disease diagnosis and treatment. If we look globally, 300 million people are impacted by genetic and rare diseases. They're often marginalized and neglected. Of that 300 million, we have more than 7,000 types of rare diseases. 80% of these diseases are of genetic origin, and 70% afflict children. The unfortunate and sobering thing about this is the average time for diagnosis is about 4 to 8 years. and a lot of times 30% of children die before age 5. Now we're in an era of a rapid advancement in technology, especially genetic and genomic diagnostics, whole gene sequencing and gene therapies. At Sidra Medicine, for example, we're treating children from various countries, and it's not just treating children from various countries with gene therapies. It's exchanging information, collaborating with these countries' academic medical systems and other hospitals to work to provide access where access previously wasn't. So by spearheading diagnostics and therapeutics, we have a great role to play, and we're perfectly positioned geographically. Now, the second is cord blood banking, which provides incredible potential in terms of technological advancement in treatment. Preservation of a newborn stem cells can lead to incredible use of cord blood to treat diseases involving blood immunologic diseases or other disorders. It's Sidra Medicine has launched the first ever in this region, in the country, cord blood banking services. We're now able to provide these services locally, regionally, and internationally. And one of the reasons why this is really important is that, again, there are a number of low and middle income countries who could benefit from these therapies, but who don't have access, be it because of cost or transportation or logistical approaches. We are perfectly positioned in the sense that collaboration with experts in the Western world, in the Far East, has allowed us to provide access to others who otherwise don't have the opportunity for this treatment. Again, another one is advancements in robotic surgery. Now, technological advancements, again, has created an environment where we can do surgeries faster, lower complications, and again, collaboration and providing access to those countries who don't have these opportunities, where we can transfer knowledge in these countries. Now, fetal and maternal medicine innovations. We know that maternal and infant mortality is still very high. It remains unacceptably high. At Sidra Medicine, where we have pioneered advancements in imaging and interventional radiology in high-risk pregnancies. Again, these global templates are transferable, and we're beginning to liaise and collaborate with other countries. Finally, genomics and population health. With our collaboration with the Qatar Precision Health Institute, we're pioneering genetic insights to drive healthcare strategies. And our work sets an example of how genome research can guide targeted public policy decisions to improve care for underrepresented populations worldwide.
Thank you, Dr. Tinubukaj. We'll come back to many of the issues you mentioned, including health disparities, but also the precision medicine and biotech is a great segue to Dr. Hilal's initiatives that he's been also leading. So I repeat the question, Dr. Hilal Lashwal, where do you see the biggest opportunities for science, technology, and innovation to drive diplomacy, particularly in your field of biotech, precision medicine, and also neuroscience, which is your research?
I'd like to start with the idea that innovation today is no longer sort of a driver for progress, but it becomes sort of an existential necessity, especially an era that is defined by rapid technological advancement and shifting global challenges. Now, I'd like to focus on biotechnology because biotechnology today is at the heart of many of the transformative innovation and the core strategies of trying to tackle many of the global challenges. From the development of life-saving vaccines to breakthroughs and innovation in precision medicine and solutions for food security and climate resilience, biotechnology innovation today are redefining not only the frontiers of these fields, but the boundaries of what's possible. But what's important to realize is that in order to realize the full potential and full impact of this innovation needs to be guided by principles of equity, inclusivity, fostering collaboration that transcends boundaries, and that transcend boundaries and global collaborations. And this is where diplomacy comes in to play and becomes essential. The challenge for most countries is how do you develop a science and innovation policy that balances your national priorities to global needs and equity goals, while at the same time promoting equity, inclusivity, and preventing the monopolization of scientific breakthroughs and technologies. And I think there are different ways where we can achieve this. One is, through the development of global framework that promotes not only the transfer of knowledge and technology from north to the south, but the concept of co-creation, co-development, and co-deployment of new technologies while prioritizing equity and shared accountability. Because we need to ensure that all of these innovations are developed not only to address the greater good or greater benefit, but while at the same time respecting the needs and values of communities across the world. And for this to happen, we also need, coordinated efforts. We heard about genomics and precision medicine. Today, most of genomic and precision medicine is driven by data, 80% of which came from population of European ancestry. So our part of the world, Africa, Southern Asia, is not represented. And here I'm proud to highlight some of the contribution of the Qatar Precision Medicine and the community of the precision health in Qatar, supported by QRDI and other entities, in which investments in biobanking, genomic technologies has enabled Qatar to be an active player in addressing that gap by bringing in that genomic information from the Arab population and the region, but also by acting as a bridge between advanced nation and those with limited resources. Just last week, Qatar Precision Health supported by QRDI to be able to transfer that know-how of what it takes to build such programs. Transfer of know-how and training. We need, therefore, a coordinated effort to ensure that the data that is diverse and unbiased, because science that sort of marginalizes a certain population is not only incomplete, it's unjust, and will continue to perpetuate inequalities. Finally, we need international collaboration that bridge and reduces those disparities, ensure fair access to these transformative innovation, but also address the inequalities usually associated with their application. So in that sense, science diplomacy and working together is essential to ensure that these
Thank you. And I appreciate that you highlighted the co-creation and co-design piece, because often collaborations, that North-South collaborations are not, they're not bidirectional, and they're not always based on intellectual reciprocity. So I think that's something we will come back to. Did you want to add something?
To add that normally when we think about North-South collaboration, the emphasis is in technology. And actually, most of our problems are not technology. They're about collective brain power in terms of this. And in that sense, the South has as much brain power as the North. In fact, many of the advances that we see in the North came from the South, that are transformative technology. So we need an equal partnership based on win-win proposition and respect, where we value the intellectual power and contribution of people in the South. And I think, you will be surprised.
Absolutely. Well, thank you. And Dr. Cardenas Suarez, you are based in the global south. I actually like to call it the global majority because this is what it is. So the same question, but also from your perspective, as someone who's based in Central America, but also in your field of work, AI, which in a way, as Dr. Leshwal mentioned about data, which has applications to biotech, there is lots of inequality and also opportunities when it comes to AI.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me on this panel. I wanted to build on something that Dr. Leshwas mentioned right now, which was that many of the problems that we're facing and also many of the opportunities really are not technological. The technologies, of course, as our previous speakers have mentioned, are incredibly impressive and very, very much, groundbreaking and life-altering. However, what I've seen in my work, in both in academia and in international development projects, is that the issues that we usually have are either structural or capacity and process based. And so I think that the greatest opportunities today are in making sure that governments are smoothing the path towards new solutions that get widely adopted and that can be transferred from one area to another. You're right. I have a foot in each side of the divide. In Mexico, of course, part of the global south, but also part of North America, and in Berkeley, where I teach. So I can see both sides of these issues. And what I've noticed is that many times governments are not set up to help make this smoothing of this transition and the deployment of these technologies across borders. Now, I want to give you just a few examples. I'll give you a couple of examples where I think things have not worked well, and then a couple of examples that are encouraging. If you look at the world of international payments, for example, which is something very technologically driven, what we've seen is that there is a hodgepodge of different kinds of systems. Every country has their own regulations. They have different ways of managing international payments, et cetera. And it's been a real problem, especially when you're looking at the cost of transferences, right? So the cost of remittances between Mexico and the United States, for example. It's not until fintech came along and really revolutionized the global payments world that we started to see some differences in happening. But even today, even though there's been some advances, and the World Economic Forum, for example, has been working very closely with the Bank of International Settlements and with other regulators to try and harmonize the rules around payment, it's still we have these problems and these inefficiencies in the global system. That's an example of something that hasn't worked well. On the other side, there's an encouraging example that concerns many countries. Mexico, as you know, is a very seismologically active country, as are some parts of the region, especially Turkey and in Morocco. We saw a terrible earthquake just a couple of years ago, and yet in that area there has been extraordinary international cooperation. And the reason that has happened is because you've had some leaders, the United States, Japan, New Zealand, and also from the global south, Mexico, who developing, quite innovative construction techniques, regulatory standards, regulatory mechanisms, and those have been spread through a very, very active research community and also companies in the construction sector that are increasingly globalized. And so, of course, the companies take this technology around the world because that's their business model. The scientists tend to organize themselves in a sort of organic way and cooperate. But there's another space there for governments as well to foster international cooperation, to get these ideas to move along. And so I think that if you contrast these two different examples, you see that what's needed is for government to exercise this convening role, right? Rather than putting up barriers, try to convene people. And there are many instruments that are at their reach. There are grants. There's grant making. There are the convening international conferences. There's a series of ways in which governments can help to make sure that all of these technologies are brought to bear on the kinds of really urgent problems that we're facing. And I would say that the most important thing that governments can do, in my estimation, is to harmonize the regulatory frameworks so that you can have these technologies move across countries more or less seamlessly, and you don't erect these barriers to cooperation that are based many times on, really sort of misalignment of priorities, and sometimes even nationalistic temptations that we really, I think, really have to avoid. And we have to move towards a world where we have more harmonization in our standards and in the way that they can work better.
Thank you. And I'll have later on a follow-up question on more details on the regulatory framework, because I think we can learn more about that piece. But also thank you for highlighting the role of governments as facilitators, among other actors who are also non-government actors. And I guess that gets to our panelist, Mr. Hussein Abdullah. In your work in the private sector, where do you see the opportunities for science, technology, and innovation to drive diplomacy, outside of government and in the private sphere?
Problem with going last is all the cool stuff's already done. Thank you for calling me doctor. My mom would have been very happy for a second there. So, I'll offer a couple of reflections, I think, that drive doctrinal approaches on the government side in being able to leverage the private sector. So most foundational models today are performing at about 80 to 90% of graduate level knowledge, not just in any one discipline, but across all disciplines. So you take a really clever kid at Stanford, grad level, biology, physics, whatever, across all disciplines, the models are already performing at that level, right? And with each new iteration of this technology in industry, with each crank, which is about 18 months in industry today, with each new crank, the technology seems to be getting 50 to 100 times more capable than the last round, right? So it is entirely reasonable to kind of expect an enormous Cambrian explosion of solutions to some of the most significant problems we have today. So, and a lot of those problems just got covered over the last few minutes, right? Whether that's healthcare, education, sort of all the greatest hits. The issue I think that the industry and vis-a-vis the industry the governments are facing is, so let's take Sam Altman as an example, and I'm just using Sam here as a shorthand. There's an industry view that getting to that level of intelligence, let's not call it super intelligence, but flexible intelligence, he's talking about trillion-dollar data centers, right? How many places in the world are we going to have trillion-dollar data centers in? Probably a couple in China, probably a couple in the US. Europe with electricity costs today, probably not. Probably one in the Middle East, right? But beyond the US and China, there aren't going to be those many countries that are going to have access to those kinds of resources. So if that's our starting premise, and I'm not necessarily saying that is the starting premise, but we're talking about a very, very expensive ball game that requires a lot of industrial planning, thousands and thousands of very, very smart people. We're talking about a lot of electricity, a lot of resources, right? That is the case. And you come to the narrow conclusion that most countries in the world are not going to have their own OpenAI. You're not going to have your own Mistral, right? And so policymakers are going to have to make a series of choices. Am I going to go with light, small, use case specific models? Or am I going to go with large, general purpose, computationally intensive models? That is not going to be aligned to my regulatory context or my jurisdiction, right? Am I going to go with Western models or am I going to go with Chinese models? Am I going to go with brick and mortar data centers within my own borders, or am I going to go with, am I okay with cloud beyond my borders, right? Now, I've been working on this for the last 2 years with governments, and I can tell you every time we've come up with a permutation of answers to these questions, it just opens up a Pandora's box of a whole bunch of known unknowns, a whole bunch of unintended consequences and trade-offs. Now, the way people are answering these questions today, most governments, right, I can tell you, is let's buy a bunch of NVIDIA chips, That's AI. Let's do that. Let's get into queue for that. And then all this other stuff, hey, you PhDs, walk away, think about it, let us know what you think, right? And you have this bifurcation of this debate happening. And in the meantime, we're all going through Commerce Department regulation to get through to those NVIDIA chips, and we're doing the hardest we can, right? Now, that's all great. But the issue is, I mean, take a place like Japan, right? Needs Chinese economic ties on the one hand and needs the American security umbrella on the other. What's their strategy? What's South Korea's? And these are two countries that have phenomenal technology baselines. They control, there are critical parts of the global technology value chain, right? So what you're finding is governments, these are questions that governments simply cannot dodge. And so that's South Korea, that's Japan, that's US, that's China. What then of the other 191 odd countries? And the final point I'll make is the reason this is important, the reason why contending with these questions at the highest levels of government is so critical is because without answers to those questions, you're not going to know where you sit in the spectrum of enormous optimism about this technology on the one hand, which is what a lot of my colleagues just covered, and then enormous caution on the other. Right? You're not going to know where you're going to sit on that spectrum. And without that answer, you really cannot inform your foreign and national security policy or what your diplomatic programming should be. So I think those are some of those critical path questions that need answering before you can figure out those diplomatic approaches on how we make the world a better place.
Thank you for sharing those insights. I think it's really important to keep that in mind. And I'll come back to Your Excellency Corman about so the tension between cooperation and competition. You've touched on it in your opening remarks, but I want to just get more into the details of how, in a way, the sausage is made. How do we put innovation diplomacy into practice? When you look into policies, should government what policies is government diplomacy is embedded and fully integrated into their foreign policy, while at the same time being compatible with the national security strategy? How can we balance the tension between both from a government standpoint?
Yes, well, as you mentioned yourself, it should be in everything that we do. We have to. First of all, there is a cultural issue, the culture of the organization. I think until today, innovation, when it comes to into the diplomatic practice, innovation only comes as an afterthought or as a side thought. It is something that we have to take on board from the very beginning. It's not always easy because the way diplomacy is practiced is very often in traditional means, both on a I remember when I was at the UN, it's only about 5 years ago, just to give a small example, when COVID-19 started in, I believe it was March 2020, we were at Security Council at the time, and we wanted to switch the Security Council meetings to video conference, which makes total sense, except that one of the P5 members thought it was impossible to do that because it had never been done before. Well, these are, when you live in such a world, you see that it's a bit difficult to integrate that thinking. But really, I think what is sometimes lacking is the force of imagination of what can be done through technology and through innovation, because a lot can be done, and we have to bring in that cultural mindset. Another important thing is our organizations have to become more agile, both at the level of governance, also at multilateral levels. You mentioned the importance of regulatory frameworks, and governments and also the UN are building regulatory frameworks. The problem is that the development of these regulatory frameworks are very slow compared to the speed at which innovation is going. And so we really have to see how can we build more agile, faster organizations, while at the same time still keep the checks and balances that we have in governments, and it actually slows down.
Yeah, I guess to sum up, the agility and of the institutions and the agencies, and also making sure that they are nimble and flexible in dealing with these questions. And you mentioned COVID-19 pandemic as an example and how it was dealt with. I'm glad we don't have to be on Zoom. We're here in person today, and I guess that's a good segue to you, Dr. Tinubukar. So the way the COVID-19 pandemic was handled from yet we know that there was a lot of debate. I mean, and controversy around like IP waivers, for example.
Right.
So some have advocated for global IP waivers for vaccines, therapeutics, diagnostics. Others argued that the call to remove IP on COVID-19 products, for example, could be counterproductive because it slows down innovation and it makes knowledge sharing more risky. So now in terms or in the context of the future of pandemic preparedness, because it's not a matter of if we will have another pandemic, it's when we will have another one.
Right.
What lessons can we draw
Well,
from the COVID-19 experience?
yeah. I mean, that was an incredible time and incredible lessons learned. I mean, COVID-19 demonstrated how accelerated collaboration can deliver life-saving breakthroughs. The development of the mRNA vaccine in record time highlighted physicians, regulators. And then also the COVAX initiative highlighted efforts about global pooling of resources for equitable vaccine distribution. There were issues, however, as you say, with respect to IP. While IP protections incentivize innovation, there were barriers. There were barriers to access to vaccines and treatments for low and especially for low income. A lot of these low-income countries did not have the manufacturing capacity or technical expertise. So as I think of lessons learned and recommendations, the power of collaboration cannot be understated. The power and investment in public-private partnerships is critical. Pre-establishment of IP agreements is something that we should technology transfer, but most importantly is transparency and trust. Data sharing is a key issue here. Innovation diplomacy has to prioritize human lives and
Thank you, and thanks also for putting the human back into the equation. You mentioned public-private partnerships, and I want to go back to Mr. Abdullah as the representative of the private sector here. What role do you see for the private sector in fostering innovation diplomacy, and also can public-private partnerships help bridge the gap or resolve that tension between the national policies and global collaboration?
So look, I think today it's fair to say that the majority of the weight being carried in this space is by the private sector. I think it would be unfair to say. Now, yes, most of that private sector is because of an incredibly deeply entrenched relationship between the US and her allies and the private sector within that domain, and then China and her allies within the private sector in their domain, right? And and governments are almost, I mean, it's fascinating because for most of tech industries past, they've been extremely apprehensive about working with government. And so for the first time, you have a lot of initiative coming out of the private sector. Is it enough? No, it's not enough. I think the gap between private sector and government, and we need the private sector to take a lot more initiative. I think the challenging thing there is that national agendas and national ambitions, it limits what they can do. understandably, right? So OpenAI can't just decide it's going to do whatever it's going to do as a part of NVIDIA. Jensen's been incredibly public about where he'd like to do, the kinds of revenue ASML has lost as a result of different kinds of instruments that governments have rolled out, or how challenging it's becoming. The last thing I'll say on this. So Eric Schmidt does this call with all the major AI companies every Friday. And he says that on these calls, and they can only talk about obviously non-corporate information, and routinely problem number 1, 2, and 3 are all the same thing, and they keep going up and down in the matrix. And generally, he said the 2 fixtures are, one is electricity, and then the other, he says, is Washington, D.C. So in one variation or another, and this is why I said this on my earlier thing, we can talk about the private sector and what it needs to do, and it needs to take more initiatives on public-private partnerships. But in the absence of the government, those things are not going to happen. And then the last point I'll make is, I think the area or the vector that's probably getting the least amount of attention, and it's incredibly disappointing, and I'm glad that's not the case in Qatar, is the academic environment. The academic environment really needs to be given a more institutionalized and vocal role within these discussions. And in most places in the world, that is not happening today.
Perhaps a follow-up question on what you just said. So how can we facilitate the integration of the academics into that conversation? Is that perhaps a role for or is there an opportunity for the private sector to partner with universities? I mean, we've seen some universities, even in the Arab region, who have tech parks and who are having a vibrant innovation ecosystem. Do you have any thoughts on how this can be enabled?
I do, and I think part of this, I've been working in government for 20 years now, and I think my starting premise on all of this is I really wish governments would stop thinking about things in terms of real estate. Half the time, any new idea pops up, and it's like, let's have a free zone, or let's have it's always invariably starts with that. I think one thing I would say is give them the resources. Pump in $200 or $300 million into any one of these clusters will work for them to become the counterbalance to the private sector. What do we do today? We build a model, we get it up to about 90% cook, then we give it to somebody and we say cook the last 10% and get it to as smart as you can, because you want it to be a neurosurgeon, you want it to be an astronaut, you want it to be whatever. Problem with these raw models is, I'm sure a lot of people know, but I just want to say this out loud. The way we test these things today is it comes off the carousel and some really smart group of people look at that model and say, I wonder what this thing knows. And they start playing around with it. Do you know how to build an IED? No, I don't know how to build an IED. How about you know how to kill a guy? Yeah, I do know how to kill a guy, all right? And so that kind of policing is simply not going to work. And the community need to do, I mean, the research papers are great and PhD theses are amazing. What they really need to be doing is building AI that can police AI. That's the job that they need to be into, because we are only a few months, maybe Q3 next year. That's when these models are going to get to a place where we won't even know what to ask them on whether they have those capabilities or not.
Thank you. And Dr. Cardenas Suarez, you work a lot on regulatory frameworks, especially for AI. So perhaps as a follow-up to Mr. Abdullah's remarks, what reforms do you think that are necessary in regulatory frameworks to enable more effective cross-border collaboration, but also cross-sectoral collaboration, let's say in the field of AI, but other fields as well?
Thank you for that question. No, I think that we've seen a movement towards regulation in the AI space at the international level. And what Ambassador Corman was saying about how regulators just don't move at the same pace, I think that's a good thing, because there's a serious risk of overregulation, or rather than overregulation, just misregulation. Right now, what we've seen, and I was at a panel earlier this morning that was very interesting. We're looking about the global digital compact and other things that the UN is doing, which are okay because they're very general, principle-based approaches. But there are lots of temptations, especially at the national level, not so much at the multilateral level. I think at the multilateral level, the glacial pace of advance kind of helps because it keeps things at a certain level of generality that I think is what we need at this point. But at the national level, there are real siren songs towards, again, economic nationalism, which we see is moving forward, but also technological nationalism, which I think is a very destructive tendency. You have concerns about data sovereignty, which I think many times are misunderstood and move towards, again, sort of protectionist tendencies at the local level. We see also in some countries adopting really sort of overbroad data localization rules, which and all of these things, what they end up doing is they make it harder, not easier, for local firms, for local universities, for the local academic environment to start developing and both the raw models or applications of the models, but also the use cases for all of this technology. I mean, what we see is that the more of these very stringent rules that you put in place, the more you hamper your local industry to actually compete. Because who are the players who can bear the cost of these rules? It's the big boys, right? They're the ones who can bear to have these minutely, regulated issues and having to have whole sets of staff just to figure out what it is a government wants. So I think we have to be very careful that we don't go in the direction of over-regulation of these emerging technologies such as AI. Now, I'm not saying that there doesn't need to be regulation, but we do have regulatory frameworks that are already in place that help us with certain issues. So we have tort law, we have contract law, we have IP protection. We've got a lot of stuff already on the books. So it's not necessarily the case that we need to throw all this out and create this whole new regulatory environment specifically designed for AI. Now, that being said, there are issues that are important. You need to make sure that there is equity, that there is fairness, that there is accountability from to the potential harms that you have from each of these technologies. What I think is that we have to be very careful, and we've got to try and resist these temptations. I see a future where if governments start to coordinate and try to harmonize their rules, so that if you are going to set up specific rules regarding, say, AI models and their use, the EU came up with a new AI law, which I think is on the right track. I don't like all of it. I think there's a lot of it that is overly prescriptive, but at least it has a risk-based approach. But if you're going to do that, then you have to set up the mechanism so that countries harmonize these rules and that you have consistent rules that are easy to navigate and that allow for example, countries in the global south to be able to compete. They're not going to compete at the trillion-dollar level data center, but there are lots of other things that are really important that can happen, especially in the application of these technologies to very specific use cases.
Thank you, and lots of food for thoughts. In terms of the need for harmonization, work with what we have. We don't have to start with a clean slate. And I see the time we are running out of time, but I want to give some closing thoughts to Dr. Leshwell to share with us some more thoughts on the current initiatives in Qatar in relation to science and innovation diplomacy and what you're doing differently that can perhaps be seen as an example for other countries. And we will take some time then to open it to questions. I will kindly ask for a few extra minutes for that. Dr. Hilal, and maybe one minute.
I'll try. So I think when we discuss diplomacy and Qatar, it's very clear that diplomacy is deeply embedded in what I call the DNA, national identity and national strategy of Qatar. We see this in Qatar's role in humanitarian aid. We see it in its leadership in conflict resolution and mediation. And it naturally extends that commitment to science and technology. In fact, Qatar has used science diplomacy to build It said, well advanced world-class higher education by bringing these world-class universities to Education City. It has also used its excellent relationship with state actors and ability to bring in, diverse views and diverse countries and convening power to bring people to Doha, for example, in Qatar, through many of the policy hubs, the WISH, the WISE, Ertina, and DIFI, which act as a convening platform to bring global leaders and experts to address regional and international and issues, focusing on solution to these issues. We're happy to see, so I would say in the early years, the focus of science diplomacy was in capacity building that global network. But over the past few years, we've seen a big transition to really from science and knowledge sharing to innovation. I can speak about some of the programs that are launched. The Qatar National Research Fund, which is now under the Qatar Research and Development and Innovation Council, was the first comprehensive competitive funding in the region that supported research funding, not in the entire Arab region, and globally, resulting in a total of collaboration with over more than 730 universities. That's one. Recently, we've heard about the new joint investment between the Qatar and the UK with the announcement of $1.3 billion to address innovation for climate change, from efficient energy to carbon management to green energy. Other mechanisms that have been utilized through, again, the QRDI is the launch of these bilateral agreement with different countries, including Spain and other countries, based on co-funding. And the Open Innovation Fund, led again by QRDI, which is, calls on people from Qatar and abroad to join force in developing innovation to address local problems and international. So I think, Qatar is now has managed to develop, a state-of-the-art R&D infrastructure and capabilities that enable it to prioritize its national and regional needs while focusing and emphasizing that global impact and driving on the basis not of how do we build capacity, but how do we co-create, how we co-develop, and how we co-innovate. And these are the principles that guide all our interaction with future, partners throughout the world.
Thank you, Dr. Leshwal, for sharing these insights. We are out of time, so I will take only one question from the audience. Please raise your hand if you have a question and introduce yourself. And maybe I do not see questions, so I guess we will stay on time. Last call for questions. If not, then please join me in thanking our panelists today. It was a fantastic session. Thank you so much.